Good evening. We are continuing our study of the questions that people have given. As Delane mentioned in our meeting, that information meeting that the elders had with the congregation a few weeks ago, that we're going to continue to do this on the fifth Sunday, and then I also indicated, as long as we have a backlog of questions, I may do it on the first Sunday of each month. And so for now, I've got enough for us tonight. And then I have a string of questions that are all related that I probably will be able to do in April. After that, I don't have any more questions, so come up with some questions. Just be honest with you. Of course, why would I be anything but honest with you? Why do we say that? That's one of the craziest things. Up until this, I've been dishonest, but now I'm going to be honest. I mean, what it makes it sound like. Anyway, I will tell you, there's probably 2 or 3 questions in that sermon this morning that may be interesting. There wasn't time to cover them, but just what is the 7 spirits of God? That'd be a good one. If somebody want to put that in there. I didn't cover that this morning. I'm not going to cover that right now. But what are the 7 horns, the 7 eyes, and the 7 spirits of God there in Revelation 5 that we looked at? Be a good question, but like I say, I'll answer whatever, to the best of my ability, whatever you ask. But if somebody want to ask that, that's fine. So anyway, so we'll look at those, and then, like I say, I've got enough for April. But as far as May goes, if I don't have anything before then we may only go back to when we do the fifth Sunday, and there's one in April. So anyway, it's up to you. We'll keep this going as long as you give the questions. So anyway, all right. Questions tonight. Oh, one more thing I want to mention. This Wednesday, we're going to look at the study that we're starting on Why I'm a Member of the Church of Christ by Leroy Brownlow. We're going to begin with his book. If you as a family did not get the supplemental study guides that I gave out Wednesday night, there are more of those in the foyer. You can grab some of those. It's fine. I made enough of them for one for each adult and each middle school and high schooler in your family. You can fill those out as a family, and there's some additional things on there. Wednesday night, I will give you the one for the next Wednesday. So I'll try to give them to you a week ahead. If you're the type that likes to read ahead, by all means do that. But we're going to go at a pace of 2 reasons per week. So please come ready to do that and study about that this coming Wednesday. Okay, here's one of the questions we're going to deal with tonight. I've got a couple of them that we're going to look at this evening. And this one's a multifaceted question. And so here's the question. Did God always dwell in the temple? If so, was he there at the destruction? Was he in Herod's temple? Was he there when the veil was torn at Jesus' death? Well, God's everywhere, so yes. We'll give a little bit better answer than that. But in a real sense, in a very realistic way, God is certainly present. But here's what I want us to do. I do want us to look at the text of some of these things. So please turn in your Bible with me to 1 Kings chapter 6. We're going to be in 1 Kings a little while, so we're going to look at that for quite a few things this evening and skim through a few different chapters, actually, here in 1 Kings, starting in chapter 6. This is the section in 1 Kings. This is right after King David has died. King David has died, and his son Solomon is now the king, and it is young into his kingdom. And so Solomon is organizing his kingdom, and he's already seen God and been able to pray for wisdom, and God's indicated that He'll give that to him. And it's kind of the point where Solomon's kind of organizing his kingdom, much like what's taking place in Washington right now. We've got a new president, so you got to reorganize everything. And so it's kind of that way here. And so one of the big things that Solomon is going to do, that his father had a vision and a hope to do, and that was to build the temple. And if you remember, God told David, I'm not going to let you do it because you're a man of blood. You're a man that's killed people. You're a man of war. And so I don't want that to be associated with my house. But God liked what David wanted to do. But God said, your son Solomon will be the one to do it. And so it's early in his kingdom, in his reign, and it comes time for him to do that. And so it tells us that that's what's going to take place. The beginning of chapter 6, Solomon gathers up the workmen, the craftsmen, and they begin to build it. In verse 2 of 1 Kings 6, he tells the size of the temple and what it's going to be. So let's read there a little bit right there. 1 Kings 6, verse 2. The house that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. The vestibule in front of the nave of the house was 20 cubits long, equal to the width of the house, 10 cubits deep and in the front of the house. And he made for a house windows with recessed frames. He also built a structure against the wall of the house, running around the walls of the house, both the nave and the inner sanctuary, and made side chambers all around. The lowest story was 5 cubits broad. The middle was 6 cubits broad, and the third was 7 cubits broad, from all around the side of the house. He made offsets on the wall in order that the supporting beams should not be inserted into the walls of the house. Okay, anyway, those numbers may not mean a lot to you, but when you look at it, 60 cubits long is the length of the house. That equates to 90 feet. 90 feet is not that big, when you really think about it, compared to a lot of structures in the world. 90 feet long, 20 cubits wide, which would be about 30 feet wide, and then also about the height, 30 cubits, so which that would be 45 feet. And so when you look 90 and 30 and 45, that's size of a good size house. A good size house that some people might live in. It's certainly not out of the question that there's houses around here that have similar dimensions. That'd be a good size one, but certainly not a massive structure compared to a lot of buildings built in the world. And so this house is made and put together, but this is going to be the temple. This is going to be the temple that God is going to be in. We know that God is going to be in the most holy place. Well, let's look past, and if you want to read this on your own time, you can read the rest of chapter 6 and chapter 7. And chapter 7 is where Solomon builds his own temple, his own palace. The furnishings are built in chapter 7, and it lists those, the different things that are made, the altar, the Ark of the Covenant, and the lampstands, and all the things that go with that. All of those things are built and put together. And then you come over to chapter 8. And this is the section that most closely relates to the question that we have tonight. And that is when they bring they build the temple and they put in all the pieces of furniture that are in there, and they have the veil that is between the holy place and the most holy place, and they put the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark that has the three things in it that we know of. The three things, the Ten Commandments. They have a pot of manna, and they have the rod that Aaron had that budded to prove that he was to be the high priest. Those things were in the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark is placed into the most holy place. In verse 10 of 1 Kings 8, it says, when the priest came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud. So when they exit, a cloud comes in. And it's such an impressive manifestation there that they can't be in its presence. It's too powerful for them, and they're not able to withstand what is there. And it says then, there at the last half of verse 11, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. And that was the purpose of the temple, that the glory of the Lord was going to be there. And so that is the premise, if you will, of this question. You know, God was there, and the glory of the Lord entered into the most holy place. And the reason why that they could not go into the most holy place, the only one that could go in there was the high priest, and then only once a day, one time on the Day of Atonement, is because that was where God's presence was. Now, so we have that established, and it took place at the point where they get the Ark of the Covenant placed in there. Now, let's go over to chapter 9. And in the meantime, in the end part of chapter 8, you have the dedication, if you will, of the temple. They worship God. Solomon, offers a prayer and offers thanks to God and makes some vows to God and all these things. And then you come over to chapter 9, and God appears to Solomon. And this is important here. You've got the temple in place, and you've got God's presence, God's glory in the temple. And now here you come to 1 Kings 9, and here's what it says. As soon as Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord, and the king's house, and all that Solomon desired to build, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your plea which you have made before me. I have consecrated this house that you have built, by putting my name there forever. And that's another part of this question. God's being there to get forever, and God makes that statement. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. And as for you, I will walk before me. If you walk before me, as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever. As I promised David your father, saying, you shall not like a man on the throne of Israel. But if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them, and the house that I have consecrated for my name. I will cast out of my sight. And Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all peoples. And this house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone passing by it will be astonished and will hiss. And they will say, why has the Lord done this to this land and to this house? Then they will say, because they abandoned the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and laid hold on their other gods and worshiped them and served them, therefore the Lord has brought all this disaster on them. And I see this text here, this answer that God gives to Solomon, as being the heart of what is going on and what is this all about. God's glory came and resided in the temple. And Solomon made his dedication. Solomon made his prayers, and they offer the first sacrifices. And then God comes to Solomon. says, Solomon, here's how it is. If you walk in the way that your father David walked, you'll always have a man on the throne. And I'll be with you and I'll bless you. And I'll stay. My presence will be in that temple from now on. You'll have me and my eyes there with you all along. But if you leave and you turn after foreign gods, you turn your heart away, I will reject this people and I'll cast this temple out of my sight. And that, in a nutshell, is what happened. You look in chapter 10 after this, and you see Solomon's wealth is mentioned. Solomon's wealth is detailed in chapter 10. This is text we looked at a few weeks ago when we looked at where the queen of the south came from. And of course, that is the Queen of Sheba. And we talked about her and how that Solomon displayed all his wealth and his wisdom before her. And a lot of that wealth is listed in chapter 10. Well, in chapter 11, if you've got a heading on chapter 11, what does chapter 11's heading say? Probably says something to the fact that Solomon turns away from God. And it is there that it says, in 11 verse 1, says, Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. And he goes on to list some of the things that he did and some of the things he did in the idolatrous ways. The great sin of Solomon was not in the multiplicity of the wives. Now, God's never been for polygamy, but that wasn't the great sin of that. The worst part of that sin was that these were all foreign women, women from these nations that the Israelites were to have no part with. They were to cast out of the land. They were to drive out of the land. And then we were to definitely never, ever intermarry with. And it wasn't a racial thing. It was a religious thing. They weren't to intermarry with them because what would they do? They would bring in their foreign gods and they would turn their hearts to other gods. And that's what Solomon did. And that's the worst thing that Solomon did, is Solomon allowed all those foreign wives to continue to worship their gods. And then they turned his heart toward those other gods. He still, you might say, continued to serve the Lord, but he served the Lord among the other gods. And we all know that's not anything acceptable to the Lord our God. That, and when you consider that subsequent kings came after him, did much of these same things. And so, the statement that God made to Solomon back in chapter 8 came very true. You know, Solomon, if you stay and follow my path and you do what my son, my servant David said, then I'm going to be with you. But if you turn away, then I'll cast away. Was God with them up until the time of the destruction? And I would say yes. Was God's glory there the moment the destruction came in? We're not really told specifically, but I think it's very clear that God said, I'm going to leave you. I'm going to cast you aside. And so at some point, in some way, God's glory left the temple, and God's glory left when the people quit serving God. And so at some point, I don't know, we're not really told, but at some point before that, God exits that. The temple is destroyed by the Babylonians when they're taken into captivity. The Babylonians take them into captivity, and the temple is laid ruined. The Babylonians, like I say, are the ones that take them into captivity. It is the Babylonians that start that, and for about 70 years they're in captivity. And while they're in Babylonian captivity, the Medo-Persian Empire takes over the Babylonians. And the Medo-Persians, they're the kings that come along. And King Darius, the one that puts Daniel into the lion's den, is one of the Medo-Persian kings. And Artaxerxes, or as he's also known as Ahasuerus, is the king that Esther marries. The Medo-Persian kings, one of them finally, Cyrus, lets the Israelites go back. And we find that out, that Cyrus makes a decree and sends them back. We find that out in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and then also in Haggai. And in the little book of Haggai, it has 2 chapters, and we don't have time to look at it right now, but I preached a sermon on Haggai not too terribly long ago. But Haggai is about rebuilding the temple and getting it back in order. And Haggai is the book where it begins, consider your ways. Remember that? Remember that lesson? Consider your ways. You plant and you build and you do all these things. And I've driven it away by drought and by wind and by mold, by other things. And everything they were doing with their vineyards, with their building projects and their homes, and all of it, God was laying it to waste. And God said, consider your ways. Why do you live in your paneled houses when my house lies in ruins? And he says, you say it's not time to build the Lord's house. And God makes the statement to them that drought and that destruction, he tells them, that was because of me. He said, I've been causing all that to come upon you. You're working harder because I'm against you. And of course, in the course of the lesson, I asked, how bad is it if God doesn't help you? Just think about how thoroughly messed up you are if God's against you. If God really is against you. Well, he was against them. And God said, consider your ways, and told them to begin to rebuild the temple. And when they began to rebuild the temple, the text says in Haggai chapter 2, and he says, from now on I will bless you. All of that negative energy that God was turning against them is now going to turn positive and work for them because they were rebuilding the temple. And so approximately in the early 500s BC, they rebuild the temple. Clearly God was behind it. God ordered them to do it. And God's glory would have come back with them. Through the course of the time, the intertestament time between Malachi and the New Testament, the temple was ravaged a time or two during the Maccabean time, and then by Alexander the Great. And it wasn't completely destroyed, but it was back kind of in ruin again. And King Herod, the awful, wicked King Herod that tried to kill Jesus when he's born, did something good, and that was rebuild the temple. He wasn't a very righteous man, but he liked to build stuff. And he was the great Jewish architect, if you will, in the last century BC. And so he rebuilt the temple, and he built it bigger and better than it was before. That was the temple that Jesus was in. Okay? So that's the temple of the New Testament. It's the temple that was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. And so was God in Herod's temple? And the answer I would say is I believe yes. Not because Herod was a righteous man, but because God honored what was done. That's the temple that Jesus would have been in when he was dedicated to the Lord. That's the temple that Jesus was in when he was 12 years old and talking with the leaders and the teachers, the Bible authorities. And what did he say about that? He said, didn't I need to be in my Father's house or about my Father's business? When Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers and the dove sellers and whatever, what did he say? He said, don't make my Father's house a house of merchandise. Don't make it a house of what we would call highway robbery. Jesus himself, the Son of God, the Word become flesh, treated the temple as holy. And I believe if Jesus treated it as holy, then God treated it as holy. And so he described it as and called it as his Father's house. And so for that, I believe that God's presence was there. Now, the question being, when did God's presence leave? We don't know that, but I would say probably, my guess would be at the time of Christ's death. You know, what we notice in that is that, you know, Christ was, he came to this earth and he lived and he died so that he could establish a new covenant, a new kingdom. And we see that, you know, that the Lord, when he was alive, he honored the temple, honored it as his Father's house. He took offense when people mistreated it and mishandled it. And so, when we see that, we notice that he regarded it as holy. And so I would believe that God regarded it as holy. When you come to Christ's death and his death on the cross, we see in Luke chapter 23 that at the point where he dies, at the ninth hour of the day when he dies, and says in verses 44 through 46, and now it was the sixth hour, and there was dark over the whole land until the ninth hour, while the sun's light faded, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. In Matthew and Mark, it tells us that the temple was torn from top to bottom. And that would be significant. But the temple was, the curtain of the temple was torn in two and torn from top to bottom. Why would top to bottom be important? Well, if a man were going to cut it, unless he had a tall ladder, which there wouldn't be there, you'd cut it from the bottom to the top. You'd start it at the bottom, and you'd pull the parts, and you'd pull them apart till it ripped all the way to the top. That's a way a human being would do it. But what about an almighty God that resided in the place? He could rip it however he wants, couldn't he? That would be the position that God would from the top to the bottom. And I think that's a significant thing as to why it's mentioned from top to bottom, because it wasn't a human being that did it. Because it was an act of God that did it. And so, I don't know, but because it doesn't tell us that God left. But the thing about the tent, God being in the most holy place, with the veil ripped, the place that he would have been open to the holy place. And so it is my feeling that it was probably there that God exited. It doesn't say that in the text, but that's my gut feeling as far as that goes. Then, of course, the temple itself is destroyed. Jesus prophesied that it would be in Matthew 24, and then in the end of Matthew 23 and in Matthew 24, and then it was in AD 70. As I've told you before, if you've got any questions or comments that relate directly to this, I'll take those at this point. Okay. All right. This one's taking a good bit of time, and so I'm going to skip the one I have for next week, for the second half tonight, and use it for the next time we've got, because it's going to be another long one as well. But hopefully this gives you a new appreciation for the temple and the things regarding the temple. If there's anything I want you to get out of it, is back to what God said to Solomon back in chapter 8 of 1 Kings, and that is, I'll be with you. But if you turn to other gods, then I'll cast this temple and all that's with it to the side. You know, we live in a nation that we call one nation that is under God. And our founding fathers put into the Constitution and carved it in stone in the buildings in Washington and put it in their writings and gave us into our Constitution and the amendments, the freedom to assemble and the freedom of religion and the things that we appreciate and enjoy. And they didn't shy away from God, and they certainly didn't shy away from Christianity. And I think the things that God said to Solomon would apply to us. If we turn our back on God, then He'll turn His back on us. But if we remain true to God, if we remain faithful to God, then He'll find a way for us to last, or at least as long as it serves His purposes. And if we're doing His will, then certainly that's what it'll be. If you tonight are not a Christian, you need to come and give your life to Christ. As we always do, we give the opportunity for that. We sing an invitation song. And I have before you here the things that we talk about in regard to what we need to do to become a Christian. And if you have need to do those, or if you have the need to come for prayers for strength or encouragement, we want to give you this opportunity. Would you please come while we stand and sing?